Hello, everyone. My name's David Howard. I'm based at the University of Oxford, and I'm delighted to have our three speakers today. Firstly, our author, Eve Hayes de Kalaf, who is the author of this book, Legal Identity, Race and Belonging in the Dominican Republic. There we are. Eve is a visiting fellow. Yeah, we'll raise the books up. Eve is a visiting researcher at the Centre for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the University of London. We also have Junot Díaz, who's a writer and creative writing professor at MIT, and Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And we'll have Raj Chetty, who's a William A. Ackman Professor of Public Economics at Harvard University. And also, oh no, you're not. I've got my information wrong. You correct me. Sorry, Raj.
No, that's the much more famous version of me. That's an economist at Harvard.
Oh no, I've done it. I'm sorry. Of course, that's right.
It's all right. I'm just merely a literature professor at St. John's University.
That's right. I'm sorry. I'm sorry because I thought, gosh, you've moved. I actually
rock on.
Exactly. That's right. And I thought, hang on. I'm sure we were in a conference not that long ago, and I thought it's no Harvard. I'm really sorry.
No,
I'm
totally
sorry. Fine. Anyway, I will get the name of Eve right. So with the plan for the launch is that Eve would give a brief resume of the book and provide an outline. And then we're asking and the real Raj to provide their commentary. Then we have questions and answers. And for the audience, do please use the Q&A chat box, but not the chat box, sorry, the Q&A. And I'll be checking those and we'll be reading them out as the discussion moves along. So Eve, over to you. And I'm delighted to have you join us as the author.
Thank you so much. I have been told that I have a slight delay with my connection, so I do apologise if it cuts out at any time. It's just one of those things when you go live. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming today. I see many familiar faces as well as really enthused about having such a great panel to talk about the book. So just to give you a quick overview then, my book, Legal Identity, Race and Belonging in the Dominican Republic, From Citizen to Foreigner, is really offering a cautionary tale with regards of the role of international development organisations and their involvement in the en masse registration of people. And the book raises, I would argue, some rather concerning issues around the concept of legal identity, access to citizenship, as well as statelessness and identity and belonging. I focus specifically on the SDG goal 16.9, which talks about the global aim of securing a legal identity for all by 2030. And this is a goal that is measured via the birth registration, principally of children. Yet what I talk about within the book and what I raise concerns about is the interconnectedness of these registration systems with other state architectures and also with people, how these structures can basically tie people to their own, not only legal identity, but also their nationality and their sense of belonging. So what I'm saying basically is that this issue is only going to become more important over the next 9 or 10 years. It's a global issue, and it's something that's going to affect over 1 billion people. We're already seeing problems with legal identity erupting around the world. I can think off the top of my head recent conversations I've had around the Rohingya, for example, or problems that we're seeing in the African context. And I really wanted to bring the Americas then to this conversation to say that, and the Dominican case I think is such a necessary and rich and crucial, really, example of where development actors really need to start sitting up and listening to the impact of registrations on people. How are people experiencing legal identity? How are people being identified within what is effectively this restructuring, reordering of populations? And principally, the shift that we've seen in the world, this huge change that I talk about in chapter 1 as being this basically a revolution, because we've seen this flip from paper systems, so paper registrations, to digital ID. So now we're getting better at the ways we're recording information about people. We're getting better at the ways that we're targeting and acknowledging and registering our citizens. And the Dominican case, I think, as I'm sure our panelists will talk about, is one to really take notice of and to include in this very, very necessary debate on some of the limitations of SDG goal 16.9.
Thank you very much indeed, Eve. So delighted to have Junot now to talk about your comments on the book. So over to you.
Yeah, first of all, congratulations, Eve. Absolutely wonderful text. And also, I mean, I spoke a little bit about this in my blurb for the book, but I also think an incredibly important intervention, supremely necessary. And I think even for those of us who have involved for a long time in the kind of activism around citizenship, just kind of clarifying in some ways. It was like a masterclass of what the heck is going on in this world at a sort of a digital infrastructural level behind many of our backs. And I think very, very important and necessary. And I kind of wanted to begin part of the reason I'm here has to do with the activism that I took part in long before what happened in the Dominican Republic and the Sentencia, and then of course, which fed into that. Something I'm very interested in at the level of an activist, but also I write about immigrant collectives and immigrant communities. And, two things that I wanted to kind of insert, because, you want to keep your comments as brief as possible, at least I do, because Eve, you're really you're it, you're the job, as they say, the reason for this. Two things I think it's very important, and I think Eve underscores them. One of these, the kind of important changes that 9/11 brought on. If we think about the two big inflection points, right? Eve situates how 9/11 and this sort of obsessive sets of overlapping security regimes around who's coming in and who's coming out, who is citizen, who's belonging, how we begin to create sort of the appropriate passports, et cetera. That was one inflection point, but I think it's good to just underscore how we're in the midst of a second one that hasn't fully revealed all of its contours yet. But if in 9/11, right after 9/11, if you had told us that a novel coronavirus would have the capacity to shut down state borders in ways that we had never seen before. I mean, we're talking in terms of Japan, we're talking about over 100 years since Japan has been this incredibly isolated. But in a way, the way this is going to rebound and going to inform a lot of the questions. And I think in the darkest scenario or the grimmest scenario, I think that it's going to resonate with a lot of the inquietudes which Eve raises in her book. And look, one of the things that why I think the case of the Dominican Republic is really, really essential is that comment that has been made, how, the ways that these kind of identity technologies are beta tested at the edges of society, right, before they get imported. The Dominican Republic, you couldn't think of a better margin, but a margin that's so connected to a core for these things to play out. And I think that, the way that Eve has in this book, and what I found just really, really important, was that Eve gives us an X-ray, right, of these digital infrastructures and these larger programmatic changes and these larger sort of just shifts in the ways that, belonging and citizenship are being implemented through the activities of all sorts of actors. Yeah, that was super just eye-opening. I think a lot of us, and I could only speak for myself, but I assume that there's other people are really unaware of some of the battles that are going on and how these battles are playing out in a digital landscape, and the roles that some of these larger corporate entities have. Yeah. And so one of the things is this idea of developers and tech companies, being the new intermediaries for migration policy. Yeah. That's, I think, huge and incredibly important, right? We're all here talking about, social media good, bad, talking about breaking up some of these monopolies, et cetera, but, how deeply these companies, these corporations, these transnational corporations have their fingers in these questions of migration is really, really important. The other thing is, I thought that, how this stuff interfaces with what we would call the, what we understand as the civil registries. How often the civil registries, while they'll get this new technology or these new sort of programs grafted over them, they still have all of their biases and all of their kind of structural inclusions utterly intact. It's really, really kind of strange. And I think Eve did a wonderful job with that. But I found that there was, the two notes that I kept coming back to when I was thinking about how this book functions, why it's so important, why for me, I've been handing it to everyone that I can. It's like a clarion call and a kind of a roadmap of futures to be avoided, right? Is one that, this is not about the Dominican Republic per se. This is about using the Dominican Republic to understand, right, the infrastructural politics and technological shifts and the ways that citizenship and recording citizenship have been changing, and how it's out of this kind of fervent that the sentencia arose, right? That there's a context to why the Dominican craziness occurred. It's not simply, as Eve points out, you can just wave your hands and say, oh, it's anti-Haitian. And I thought it was very important, this second point, that, where Eve says we need to de-Haitianize this question when looking at the Dominican Republic. And it's not to underplay, as Eve, you say very clearly, the anti-Haitian sentiment or engine that drives a lot of this. But it's also to show that there's a larger context and that there's much more responsibility. And that in some ways, the way that it gets boiled down to the simplification, that it's this anti-Haitian sort of, or it's the anti-Haitian of Dominicans, which is clearly part of it, or it's that it's this border conflict with the Dominican Republic and Haiti, just absolutely lets everyone off the hook and allows us to, I would argue, strategically misunderstand what in the world is happening. How all sorts of actors, sort of global bodies, non-governmental organizations helped to create this crisis. Yeah. And by simply reducing it down to this kind of like the racial or ethnic conflict, which I think is a big part of it, and Eve says is a big part of it, just distorts the entire picture. I could go on, but I didn't want to go on too long. I only had 10 minutes and I wanted to pass it on. Just how these systems, as Eve says, help to maintain and manufacture foreignness within their own citizens, something that I think has to be addressed. And for all of us, this book, I think, is an absolute cornerstone of that kind of inquiry.
Thank you very much indeed, Junot. It's a really important point about how the book sort of highlights the bigger issues that we're reading about daily or watching on the news in court cases, etc. So we'll now move over to Raj Chetty, with immense apologies for my very, just the Schoolboy Era. Schoolboy Era is returning. So it's my privilege to introduce Raj Chetty, who is an associate professor in English at the St. John's College of Liberal Arts and Sciences in New York City. Raj, over to you, and I will I'll be apologizing in person one day, I hope, but I'm apologizing now. But over to you, and let's hear what you have to say about Eve's book.
Thanks, David. Really, no problem. It's why I made my Twitter account the Ross Chetty, just as a sort of as a joke. And I want to thank everyone, even in particular, for writing this book and then inviting me. I've heard some of this stuff. Obviously, we've had conversations in conference settings and in other settings. Honored to be here, Juno, with you and David, both to have this conversation. And as Juno pointed out, to be able to turn the floor back over to you, Eve, to sort of talk through some of the questions that the book raises and some of the challenges it poses. I think Juno's done a really great job of explaining what an intervention, crucially, that this is. And I've written some remarks, so this is going to be a little bit read, and in some parts I'm going to do less reading. So forgive those who were expecting a little bit more off the cuff. But I started this by thinking about how in 2016 I attended a talk at the Caribbean Studies Association, which is at that time it was held in Port-au-Prince in Haiti, by Professor R.A. Judy, who teaches at the University of Pittsburgh, a scholar in Black diaspora studies. He studies, and particularly studies the Arab Spring Revolution, the Tunisian Revolution, and his talk was on Frantz Fanon's relevance for the Tunisian Revolution in 2011, and how they were reading the rest of the earth and how it was working. And I was enamored of the idea because I had my own interest in Fanon and its relation to, for Fanon, the Martinican anti-colonial thinker and writer, for him a much closer geographically place, the Dominican Republic. So I am sort of writing through how does Fanon's work in specifically Black Skin, White Masks have some relevance to a sibling Caribbean country, the Dominican Republic. So the history of Martinique and the history of the Dominican Republic aren't the same, but they are both sort of Caribbean archipelagic islands that have a sort of shared history of sort of colonialism, white supremacy, and the perpetuation of sort of neo-colonial forms of governance and anti-Blackness in particular. So the reason Fanon's interesting to me is because he's got this concept of recognition and subjectivity, and that recognition for Blacks in particular, or those who are under historical and contemporary conditions of coloniality, it's compromised by colonialism, it's compromised by white supremacy. So the very idea of recognition is compromised by these conditions. And specifically the chapter, The Black Man in Recognition of Black Skin, White Masks, he outlines the Martinican specificity of his intervention, creolizing Western European concepts of recognition from Hegel to Paul Ricoeur, and psychologists from Freud to Adler. And so in engaging with your book, Eve, and this really important contribution, I've been able to think a little bit more about this disciplinary triangulation between state recognition or incorporation or inclusion, or as you put, like exclusion, and sort of the ability to exploit by keeping people in sort of marginalized positions. So this triangulation between state recognition, racial Blackness, and citizenship. And so what your book does, or I'm going to use the third person since what Dr. Hayes's book does, is insert this crucial component of state technologies of digital identification as a critical node in thinking through this triangulation. So I previously, in my own work, I've been thinking through the idea of recognition as a way to analyze how the concept of recognition operates in discussions, mostly sort of public media, public intellectual discussions of this Dominican citizenship / denationalization crisis and the overlapping but distinct immigration / deportation crisis. And this is one of the powerful claims that Dr. Hayes makes across her book. Too often, the external and often sometimes perhaps even internal scholarly and NGO and activist attention to the Haitian crisis focuses on Haitian migrants who are deported or deportable, or particularly vulnerable people like Dominican children of Haitian descent who are not registered or whose registration gets categorized under this sort of new, sort of neutral sounding word like irregular or irregularidades. And what gets lost are the Dominicans of Haitian descent, and this is some of what your book is pointing out, whom the state is not interested in expelling, but in retaining under continued conditions of hyper-exploitability through civil and social entrapment that are enabled by state-sponsored mechanisms of registration. So perhaps the singular achievement, I don't think that's only one achievement, of Dr. Hayes' book is to insert into what far too many see as merely a Dominican state problem, and this is sort of echoing what Juno was saying, the crucial role that international organizations play, primarily, though not exclusively, the World Bank, via the programs that tie poverty reduction to state digital registration. So you brilliantly argue that what gets passed off ideologically as an attempt to address poverty and perhaps alleviate it collides forcefully with this long history of anti-Blackness and anti-Haitianness practices that date to the colonial period. Obviously, this is a 500-year honed practice into state formation and all the way through today. So one thing that strikes me in Dr. Hayes' work, implicitly there, but part of me wonders if maybe it could be more explicit, and this is something perhaps we could talk about more, is the way that Eurocentric ideas of the state, ideas that could falsely universalize as modern or falsely universalize as global, these Eurocentric ideas of the state function as something of a repetition with a minor difference. It's sort of in 2010 to, I'm now going to Trujillo in the 1930s. For example, what Dr. Hayes points out is that former President Leonel Fernandez, and here I'm quoting, needed to prove to investors and international donors that the country was now and here's the key phrase, a modern, global, and democratic state that could remain politically and economically stable. That's the end of the quote. Eventually, this meant, among other things, incorporating ideas about digital registration that World Bank grant monies were tied up in, ostensibly as a way to appear less anti-Haitian or less anti-Black. And this is the irony. This is the great irony of it, by allegedly addressing financial precarity among those the state had failed to document or register in the past. But as, and I'm going to quote from you again, Dr. Hayes points out, quote, in parallel to these actions, the Dominican state was subtly introducing a series of administrative and procedural changes that not only blocked the Haitian descendant from acquiring their birth certificates, but also stopped them from obtaining or renewing any new forms of documentation. End of the quote. I couldn't help but think about how the Dominican state under the Trujillo regime was also eager to establish itself as a modern state during the 1930s, the rise of fascist Italy and Spain and Germany, in addition to the rest of the fascist world that was doing all the colonial malarkey everywhere else in Africa and the Caribbean, through mechanisms then that were the hallmarks of the modern state: strict borders, strong national military, assertions of sovereignty in the face of imagined foreign invasion or intervention, right? And so those echoes, everybody here knows about that the 1937 massacre in the border region had, among other reasons, this assertion of a kind of retrograde idea of national sovereignty. And the echoes today in what Dr. Hayes is demonstrating in her book are haunting. What was particularly striking for me was the way that the World Bank, for F's sake, made overtures to ideas of sovereignty in deferring to the Dominican state's ability to flex its exclusionary power via la sentencia and its subsequent bureaucratic measures that sort of moved one-time citizens into, at least if not temporary, I mean, you're pointing out how it may not be temporary, a kind of foreign status, sort of a perhaps permanent, right? What one of the interviewers you said, how am I all of a sudden a foreigner, right? How am I all of a sudden Haitian as a mark of foreignness, not as an identity mark, right? Which is sort of a crucial distinction you're drawing. Okay, so I want to circle back in my last little part to Professor Judy's comments. I talked with him a little bit after his presentation because I was like, I don't know what to do with Fanon in the Dominican Republic, help me. And he was gracious enough to sit down and listen. And he asked this really pointed question. He said, and he meant it, he even qualified it. He said, I mean, this is a real question, not as a provocation, not as a challenge. It's like, in the Dominican Republic, who is Black? And it was it's a thing that I've been sitting with quite a bit and still animating my thinking. And it reminded me a little bit, Gina Athena Elise, an amazing anthropologist and scholar and a Haitian-American woman, in 2015, as deportations were ramping up in the Dominican Republic. And obviously in the wake of La Sentencia, she had a piece that she wrote in Africa as a Country called A Certain Kind of Black, right? So this sort of nuanced attention to who is Black or which kinds of Black people are being racialized as such and thus materially harmed, right? So denationalized and or able to be exploited continually. And it came back as I was reading the chapter that featured the voices of the people that you interviewed. In particular, I was struck by the lawyer who was of Haitian descent, but who strategically kept that hidden from all of his friends because he knew the consequences of it. So on the one hand, he was functioning as a Dominican, right? And not functioning in the sense that it was fake, but without being sort of outed as also having been of Haitian origin. And he did it strategically, and it wasn't, again, a sort of self-hating move that too often might become the normative reasoning. It was to protect against. And then as soon as he appeared on the registry list, I think it was list A, all of a sudden friends were like, I didn't think you were Haitian. But what was striking to me is he said, I'm educated. My dad was not a cane cutter. In other words, he sort of drew a distinction between other sort of tropes of what it means to be Haitian, and one might say Black, in the Dominican Republic, as he was distinct from it. And for me, what's fascinating is this is exactly what Fanon writes about. The way white supremacy produces a psychological need to distance oneself either verbally or socially from Blackness by pointing at the ones one is not. Those people are Black. Now, what's striking here is this lawyer wasn't saying, I'm not Black and I'm not Haitian. But in his rhetoric, he's talking about distancing himself from those elements of social identity associated in the Dominican Republic with a certain kind of Black person, that is the poor, cane-cutting, Bate-residing Haitian. Okay, that's, I think, more than enough time for me to sort of talk to these things. I have a whole bunch of other things I would love to ask you about, but these are the really important questions that sort of came to me as I was reading, that I think, again, as Junot's pointing out, your book is pointing to a particular case that illuminates a broader racialized and gendered state practice of digital incorporation that is always already, to do too much Derrida, about exclusion and exploitation. Thanks.
And thank you very much indeed, Raj. Chetty, Associate Professor in English, St. John's College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, New York City. Thank you very much indeed. Eve, I think we in our sort of schedule, we have over to you really for your responses to Juno and Raj's comments. And also for those audience, I'm sure we have many on either side of the Atlantic. Do write in your Q&A, your questions in the Q&A list, and we'll read those out and get round to them after Eve's comments. Eve, over to you.
I just thank you so much to both of you, to Junot and Raj. That was just, it's really fulfilling actually to actually hear people who've read the book and really taken on board its core themes and what I've been trying to achieve over these past 7 years. So I just want to say thank you so much. There's so much richness, I think, in the Dominican case, and I think Junot really hit the nail on the head when he said, you know, I think that's what I always wanted to do was link what was happening in the Dominican Republic to a broader discourse. And here in Senate House, where I am at the moment, in 2018, we had a global Dominican conference. And I think Raj was at that conference, and many colleagues, I think, who are on this call today. And that was very much what we discussed was we need to talk about, we need to fit the not just look to the island, not just look what's happening on the island, but actually understand how this is responding to and reacting to different global shifts and changes. And as you know, as David's written about, for example, you know, this has been going on for several hundred years. This is no coincidence, really. In fact, it's actually mind-blowing that the Dominican Republic was used as this World Bank testing ground, really, for the rollout of such these ID systems. When you think about in terms of colonialism, when you think in terms of slavery, when you think about these fraught and complex issues of settler colonialism, among others, this is a problem. So it really did start something sparked in me, really, when I started thinking about the linkages, really, between the island. And that's one point that I will come on to what you all discussed, but that's why the question of universalism, as Raj was talking about, is so essential, because I think universalism can in many ways be a silencing mechanism. The idea that we all, and that is very much integral to the human rights system as well. And I think when we rely and look to the human rights framework to kind of respond to some of these questions, we also need to be self-critical and self-aware to see when there are limitations with those frameworks and those arguments. So universalism is certainly something that I probably could have explored more in the book, but is really central to a lot of these ideas. as Junot started out talking about 9/11, that was really, you're absolutely right. I think if we went back in time and we actually told people about what is happening now, how ID systems are being weaponized, and how these kind of heteronormative ideas as well about how identity systems play out and how we are structuring kind of our citizenry. It's really an urgent and timely question, because it's not, and as I repeat in the book, it's not just about people crossing borders. We increasingly need to be conscious of what is happening to people living within them, because this question is not solely going to or affecting migrants or the migrant descended. It's going to affect all of us. And that's very crucial when we look at questions of inclusion and exclusion. Inevitably, any system that purports to include, and specifically in this universal way, so when we talk about social protection measures and a universal and legal identity for all, where there is inclusion, there will always be exclusion. That's inevitable. And there's a blind spot there in international development thinking, or maybe not so much, maybe I'm being a little bit naive there, but the way that these systems have been rolled out and the contestations then that are happening on the ground, that are emerging, clearly not just in the Dominican context, but in other examples as well, they're not listening. And that's, I talked about this in an interview recently, but if they're not, if the people who are developing these programs, if they're promoting these programs and rolling them out en masse to 1 billion people, and they're not paying attention to where problems are arising, then this is not going to go away, I don't think. And again, what Junot was saying about how data is stored, I think that's such a crucial question. So one thing that we know is the big tech companies themselves, they're not sat at the table. They're not part of this conversation, because they're kind of in the background. But if we think about the way identity data, so identity information and data is stored, it doesn't respect boundaries, it doesn't respect borders. So it's very interesting that you have a case that is so fervently, nationalistic and kind of this very controversial issue, but the mechanisms being used to kind of address these systems don't think along national lines at all. I think that's really fascinating, the more that we learn about digital technologies and how, again, civil registries are kind of adopting their new technologies, which are, of course, as we've said, which are holding these biases and leading to a somewhat dystopian future, I would argue. Again, the Eurocentric ideas around questions of the state, absolutely. I think we could even say, and maybe I should have said this a bit more in the book, but if we think about citizenship really as a form of white supremacy, because the idea of what civility means, the idea of formalizing the citizenry, the idea that we all must have some kind of evidentiary proof of who we are and what group we belong to, is very much wrapped within white supremacy. So as much as I agree and really appreciate the comments of Raj, who is asking these very essential questions, who is Black, and how is that being understood, and it's shape-shifting as well. That's the other thing. So race is, it's not a static concept, it's something that changes, and I say that right at the beginning of the book. It can depend on it can depend on your interactions with other people, how they perceive you, the context that across social class and status and gender as well. It's not something that is set in stone. And if we think of race as being a social construct, and the fact that so it's something that is literally being constructed, being made, then for me, the starting point was to then look at the very institutions then that are building these infrastructures around how they're identifying citizens, because just as much as these things can be made, they can also be unmade, and that was always something that was a big concern to me. And the main motivation then, before we go to questions, the main motivation for the book was really to amplify the lived experiences of people, because that is what the international development sector is not doing at the moment. They have this kind of, largely normative discourse. I said that, these plans and development programs are being thought up in offices in Washington and in other places, but actually the engagement with the people, with the users of these systems, with citizens, of how they're experiencing ID is largely being, is not being thought out and is not being included into policy. And I love what you said, Raj, about how this resonates with Trujillo, and that was exactly what the women who I think they're in La Romana, and the women who are of Caribbean Anglophone descent talked about. And they were very elderly women who remembered. They kept saying, they're telling us to get our ID. Before it was a paper card, now it's this, biometric card. And they were saying, be careful. You should be worried about this, because we saw this with El Tirano. We saw how this played out back in the 50s and in the 40s and 50s, and it didn't bode well. And what was so fascinating about that, going back to ideas around how we think about how people are experiencing this, is that they were saying, before we used to be told, when we used to speak English to each other, the military would hit us with a stick and they'd come after us and say, stop speaking Haitiano. And now actually they found that their descendants, their grandchildren are now they're now a commodity for the state, because English is suddenly for in call centres or for the tourism industry is suddenly something that's being welcomed. So I think it's also the idea of how the state can be like very, very exclusionary and push people away, but also how it then, because our identities are so closely tied to the economy and to our and to basically, as I'm saying, to welfare systems, to pensions, to how we act as consumers. That's why then the private sector is so interested in this. That's why states are so interested in benefiting, financially benefiting from certain segments of the population. Whereas at the same time, it doesn't want to recognise the citizenship rights of other segments of the population. So for Haitian descended, they don't want to recognise them. They don't want to welcome them within the formal economy. They don't want to recognise their pensions. They don't want to, give them their cédula, because once you have your cédula, your ID card, then you have, it's a currency. Then you have your recognition as a citizen. So those plays and complex ideas were, something that I think were only brought out and I was only able to explore because of the amazing interviews that I did with some incredible people who just were so clear about the way that, how getting across about how they were experiencing these systems. And just maybe I'll just end on this, but I found it very fascinating when I spoke to a woman who was born to Japanese parents, and she was talking about how she was brought over by Trujillo. They were invited by Trujillo, but they were seen as white. So they were Japanese, but they're seen as they were welcomed as white. So that's what I was trying to get across in the book, which is very difficult to say, that our identities and how they interact with one another and how they change and shapeshift over historically and through our interactions with different people and through our interactions with the market and the economy are not set in stone. And that's why there are so many excellent stories basically to come out of that and to be shared from this.
Thank you very much, Eve. I'll just ask whether Junot or Raj want to sort of add some more comments to their comments, but also in the meantime, encourage everyone to ask a question if you have one. We have a nice comment from Chuck, who I'll read out, Eve. I just wanted to say that this is really important work and a beautiful presentation. So do add comments like that or any questions in the Q&A, and we'll be glad to read them out and respond to them. Junot, Raj, do you want anything else to add to what Eve has been saying about her book?
I only had one small thing, which I think which is kind of important especially because of the sort of the public nature of our discussion. And it's not just simply to blow smoke, but was not easy work. When I look at the foot miles and the wheel miles that were put into this, and why perhaps it's sometimes easy for these kinds of shifts or these kinds of regimes to elude our critical scrutiny. Eve points out in the text, in a different context, about assemblages. We understand there's an entire critical vocabulary around assemblage, which continues to grow, but that this book really required so much just footwork. It wasn't just the pencil miles. And, that would be the only comment I would leave, is that, what you made visible was only visible because it seemed like you broke every bone in your metaphorical body to get it done. And that, a lot of the complexities of how we need to understand our world elude scholarship and elude critical scrutiny without an enormous commitment to the kinds of field work that I think has become harder to come by these days. And in a Dominican context must have been daunting. So that's it. More just comment,
Yeah, thank you. Just to respond to that, yes, you're absolutely right. This was a labour of love. I can't really put it any other way. But it was, as I say at the beginning of the book, born from a desire to amplify the voices of Dominicans, basically, and it's from a love of having lived there for so long, having myself become a Dominican citizen, having just an absolute respect really for the stories and for the oral histories, I might even add, of the people that I met along the way. And there's such a richness in that. And oftentimes there are, I think what can happen within scholarship is because people come at it from, so I really did it from the grassroots up. Yeah, I'd lived on the island for such a long time. I had so many questions, and I didn't know where to direct those, or really what I was seeing. I couldn't find, and it was really once I started reading basically as much as I could, that I could start giving it some kind of context and some kind of structure and some kind of, basically give the bones to the project. And yeah, you're right, it wasn't easy, but it had to be done. It was important work because, as I was saying, I think that people, and that's not to detract from the work that is taking place along the Haitian-Dominican border or in in Bateas, so on the sugarcane plantation, that is absolutely valuable and vital work. But I think we also need to, as I said, we need to think about the assemblages, the linkages, the interconnectedness, as I've said, of these experiences with a broader kind of global framework. And I really hope that I think I'm very proud to say that I have achieved that with the book, and I'm hoping that I always wanted this book to be a teaching resource. That was always the point. I want it to be on reading list. I want students to kind of engage with it and get excited by it. And that's why I approached the book in the way that I did, because, and that's why I centralised those interviews and those stories that I collated along the way. And yeah, that's it really. Just thank you for those comments.
Thanks, Eve. Just before we started the seminar discussion, Eve was saying, well, I'm not a creative writer. I'm a social scientist, but I think one of the strengths of the book is, as exactly we discussed, the rigor of research. But just reading through it, it's a good read. I mean, it's a good read about bad stuff in many ways. But I think the oral histories and discussions are just really nice way to weave the book together. And it's addressing the big pictures of technology, citizenship, legality, and some quite detailed legal frameworks, etc. But I think the way you've wove those stories from interviews into the story is a really, really nice way of creating that narrative all the way through. So you may be going to do the creative writing with Junot in MIT. You never know. That's the next step. Raj, over to you.
No, thanks. And Junot, I want to echo what you were saying, and what Eve, you were sort of elaborating on a little bit, and add to it in the same spirit, sort of the literal footwork, the literal sort of field work, sort of walking and talking with people, and minor moments in the text, the way that language is such a crucial element of that you could interview and talk with people in Spanish, and in the moment where like you conducted an interview in Creole with one of the informants, who was born in if I'm not mistaken, in La Romana, but grew up in Haiti. I can't remember, somewhere sort of on the southwest of Haiti. And that interview you conducted, which is one of the shorter ones, or sort of one of the shorter vignettes, or one of the shorter stories. There was just a moment in that reason we conducted this interview in Creole. And so I wanted to flag that also as kind of part of the work, is this sort of moving between languages, right? And yes, in many cases, many social scientists, anthropologists, and others do that work, have a translator with them, and that there's nothing wrong with having translators with you, but that you were able to do this stuff. And I don't know how strong your Creole abilities are, but I was like, wow, this is like, you did this in Creole. And if you don't have them and had a translator instead, there's no shame in that either. But no, okay, I didn't think so. I thought this was you. That, and then second, now this is sort of going in a different direction. One of the questions I have, this is maybe, I have two questions, but let me do one of them. One of the questions about this is about this term undocumented, that in the United States has a particular meaning. And I know that meaning is not the meaning you're using in the book. And you have, I think, a footnote early on. It's like, when I say undocumented, I mean people who are not sort of in the registry at the state level, which is a large, has been a large number of the Dominican population, or people residing in the Dominican Republic. And it's not just those who are foreign. It's just sort of a state bureaucratic mess that so many people aren't registered when they're born, or have historically not been registered when they're born. I mean, that this is sort of, these are parts of these efforts. But I wonder still, even though the term, you're careful to say that you don't mean the same thing, or you're careful to see what you mean by this term, I wonder if it's weighted too much for even your footnote to overcome what we understand, at least in the US, as the term undocumented, because that term is, as a sort of replacement for illegal, as a much more racialized and very sort of racist term in the U.S. context, that evokes the specter of the so-called Mexican laborer, sometimes the Black immigrant who is quote unquote illegal. But so I wonder, one, if that term might have too much weight to work as appropriately in the different context that you're talking about it, even though you make clear what the different meaning is. And what other term or terms or phrasing could capture what you're trying to say, which I think is a really crucial point, without the weight of that term. And I was reading, like, the thing I came up with, and I sort of used it was those who the state has failed to document. Again, as a way to sort of really emphasize the onus of responsibility for this documentation isn't the person who then becomes responsible to pay all the fees for the Wawa to get to the Capitol, to pay all the fees for the phone calls, or to do all the fee paying, that responsibility that the state has, maybe should have had, failed to do, and is now saying, oh, we're going to get it right, but then ask people to pay so much money informally or formally in order to get it done. So that's just a sort of a question about just a term that seems also at the center of your book.
Thank you. I think where I take that point is really that it's very difficult when you're working with kind of policy, because basically what I'm doing is I'm comparing and contrasting kind of normatively driven policy, and then tracing it and seeing how that's impacting people on the ground. And the huge problem with that is language. Of course it is, because there are so many limitations. And I think I was rereading the book this morning and I saw the word illegal and went, oh, and cringed, because the problem is you don't want to then take these problematic terms and then kind of mirror them. And then and I had that actually with the field work as well, because you don't want to, I didn't want to go there and identify people and say, I'm going to impose what I think you're, like how you identify and who you are. Because what I was trying to get out was how many contradictions there are within that within people's own sense of belonging. There were people who some people really cared about what their documents said. They cared that they would be in called Haitian when they used to have documents that said they were Dominicans, and other people just said, and I think this is the crux of a lot of it is that people just want to get on with their day-to-day life. Just give me whatever you're telling me I have to carry with me, but let me keep going to Western Union to get my remittances, or let me just let me carry on with my. Why are things getting so difficult now? And language, yeah, absolutely. Because I said I want it as a teaching tool. What I've tried to do a little bit is kind of push that question to the reader and say, look, I'm challenging you now. I'm saying that this is maybe the way that we've been framing this and looking at this in the past. We need to move on from that, and we need to push the scholarship forward. And part of that is finding a new language. It is finding a new way of talking about people. I talk about el tollo, which is like the mess. It's very hard to write about bureaucratic mess. Or as Arendt might say, the banality of evil, the fact that you've got these systems that some of them have an underpinning logic, and part of it was trying to say, okay, I am this person's experience, it's because the policy worked in this way and it affected them this way. But also to say, actually, they contradict one another constantly, and they change constantly. And so that's why there's such a sense of instability and uncertainty for a lot of people, because of this. So one example I give are the three brothers. Yeah, the one guy who's a bouncer. There's one guy who's so basically the first brother had. Untold, he kept getting arrested by the police. He was told to cut his hair. He was being sent back and forth to Santo Domingo, to the capital, to then justify his Dominicanness to a civil registry official. And the second brother was because he was into baseball, because he'd been scout, because a baseball scout had kind of, and I know you like baseball, Raj, so I thought I'd put that one in there, who had picked up on this and said, hey, we're going to get you off to the States. So automatically, we go off, we get you we get your passport, and off you go. And the third brother, who had no form of ID and was being told by the mayor that he was Haitian and to get his Haitian ID. So these are three brothers born in the same family, in the same situation or circumstance, but who had three completely contrasting and different interactions and stories about the civil registry. So yeah, I definitely think, we need to challenge this language. We need to start saying, hold on, that's not a term that I'm comfortable with. So that one of the terms I wasn't comfortable with was Haitian Dominican. I'm not saying that other people shouldn't use that term, but I'm saying I found that difficult. So I use the term people of Haitian descent, which is how I found comfortable. But I would like other scholars and other researchers to think about that. Think about, don't just automatically adopt language around citizenship, around migration, around registrations, and just take it as read. Explore it a bit more, unpack it a bit more, and try and see what else is going on.
Thanks very much, Steve. Some really important points there. Thank you. We have a couple of questions, so I'll hand over, as it were, to our audience. Steve asks, is this an aspect of the control of the migration of labour, keeping workers where wages are low, while capital is free to move across borders to exploit cheap labour?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Stephen. Nice to see you. I'm sorry I can't see you in person today. I talk about it as a policy or a strategy to keep people in situ. So I think there's a danger there when people talk about the sentencia and the impact of the sentencia. Its main motivation being to deport people. In fact, going back to languages, as Raj was talking about, you expulse citizens and you deport migrants again. So there's those kind of nuances there that I think sometimes we overlook. But I really argue that, by ensuring that by literally converting certain people who had their documents, Dominican documents, and now talking about them as foreigners and non-belongers, it's more about, you still need that labour and you still need that, that cheap labour source. But what you don't want to do is acknowledge their rights as citizens to certain services. So that is absolutely, I think, Steve. And I'm saying it's not just about then cross-border policy, but it's also about inside the country what's happening as well. And I think we can apply that certainly to the UK, and we've seen that happen with the Windrush scandal recently. So yeah, certainly, I think that's a great question, and thank you.
Thanks very much, Steve and Eve. Bronwyn has a question. It's about human rights advocacy, in particular litigation. So what do you think was the impact of the efforts to litigate access to citizenship in the Dominican Republic? Not just the cases that led to the sentencia and the impact of that judgment, but also the engagement with the inter-American system. How does litigation interact with other forms of protest and mobilization? And I wonder, it might be worth if you just sort of outline the sentencia, because your book starts obviously with the sentencia of 2013. So for the very few people who haven't read the book already, would you just want to briefly give the context and then answer Bronwyn's question about litigation and its impact or interaction with other forms of protest?
Yeah, great to see you again, Bronwyn, as well. Thank you for that question. So in 2013, the Constitutional Tribunal of the Dominican Republic ruled that its plaintiff, Juliana Díaz, who was born in the Dominican Republic to Haitian migrant parents and had been issued with a Dominican birth certificate, they decided that she wasn't a Dominican at all. In fact, they told her that she was a Haitian national, that she should basically ask the Haitian government for her documents, and they effectively made her birth certificate, Dominican birth certificate, null and void. And what was so shocking about the ruling, and this is where I think, so as Bronwyn is referring to, this was kind of the culmination of years of legal wranglings, of I call it a tug of war, basically, between international NGOs and also migrant rights NGOs in the Dominican Republic, who harness the inter-American system, basically, so harness the human rights framework to say, you know, you've got to start recognizing children born to migrants as Dominicans because your constitution recognizes them and they have a right to this documentation, because the thinking behind it being that a birth certificate will then unlock rights. Yeah, it's the idea that by it will then lead to other rights. And the tribunal ruling, what was so shocking about it and why I wrote the book, basically, it was a motivating factor for writing the book, was the fact that it was implemented retroactively. So the judges stated that from 1929 until 2007, although there's a bit of there's a bit of a kind of gap between those dates, but basically between 2007 and 2010 when there were constitutional changes, but basically saying that for over 80 years, the Dominican Civil Registry, yes, had been giving people either a birth certificate or an ID card, which stated, you know, that was given to them and stated they were Dominican, but actually that was committed in error. That actually they because they were born to Haitian migrants, they were seen as being born in transit, and therefore, and you know, this idea that you can be in transit for your entire life, for example, which is astounding, really. But that was essentially what the sentencia did. It targeted Juliana Díaz, but really then it basically impacted tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of Haitian descended and migrant descended, but largely, if not principally, Haitian descended people born in the Dominican Republic, tens of thousands of whom, and this is what I say in the book, already had state-issued documents as Dominicans. So yeah, it's complex, and I don't think I've answered Bronwyn's question, but she's asking about the inter-American system was very important for domestic and international NGOs because they used it as a form of jurisprudence. It was for activists. It was a strategy, really, to push and to force the Dominican state to acknowledge then the birthright citizenship then of children born to migrants. And there was kind of this. I do mention it in the book, and it becomes very complex in terms of court rulings and inter-American court rulings and decisions that were made. But basically, it was this tension, this fight, then between the Dominican state and then between these NGOs who were saying, the NGOs saying, you need to recognize, you need to give these people, these children, basically their documents, and the state resisting. So that was very important then in the activist movement. And what I tried to achieve with the book that Junot then was saying was really to say, I want it to be a toolkit again for activists to say, okay, is this a helpful way of framing what happened? Is this a helpful way of thinking about what happened, and where can we move forward? Where can we move on from this? So I'm just very much looking forward to people reaching out to me when they've read it to hear their thoughts on that.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, we agreed we would be on the hour. I know you're going to celebrate the book in sunny London, so we'll let you go on to your celebrations. I'd like to thank both Junot and Raj for the great comments, and I hope that I'm on a panel at some stage with Raj and you can get my name totally wrong, and I will be grateful for that. So I apologize for that. But really, thank you very much, especially to Eve. There's the book. And you think you set out what you sought to do, and we've probably all had chats with you along the way, and it's brilliant and it's very privileged to be part of your launch. So Eve, thank you very much, and we will let everyone else get on with their days. So thank you so much, and bye-bye all. Thank you.